And welcome everyone. I'm so excited to have Dick Schwartz with us today. This is our first live interview in the Seekers Forum after 12 years. I thought it was about time that we had a little more interaction. I've been talking to all these wonderful thinkers and teachers for all these years, but Dick is a really one of my favorite teachers. I'd like to just tell you a few things about him before we begin. Richard Schwartz is a systemic family therapist, academic, author, and creator of the internal family systems, a branch of therapy. Dick developed his foundational work with IFS in the 1980s after noticing that his clients were made up of so many different parts of their self. As he teaches, quote, our inner parts contain valuable qualities, and our core self knows how to heal, allowing us to become integrated and whole. In IFS, all parts are welcome, unquote. Dick is the author of many books and articles, including No Bad Parts, You Are the One You've Been Waiting For, and The Mosaic Mind. He's a featured speaker at many national conferences and has taught at numerous institutions, including the University of Chicago, Northwestern University, as well as Harvard Medical School. His Center for Self-Leadership in Oak Park, Illinois, coordinates IFS trainings in the United States and internationally, and I am delighted to have Dick Schwartz as our guest today. Welcome, Dick.
Thanks, Mark. I'm delighted to be with you and to be the first, I guess, live one, right?
You're the first live one. Yes. Good. So let's dive right in. I want to start with something that you've written to give folks an introduction to your work. You've written, quote, when we simply turn our attention inside, we find that what we thought were random thoughts and emotions comprise a buzzing inner community that has been interacting behind the scenes throughout our lives, unquote. Now, as spiritual practitioners, we are often counseled not to take the movements of the monkey mind seriously. We're taught to see the mind as this one big crazy thing, the mono mind, as you put it. How does this belief in the mono mind hold us back from self-understanding?
Well, yeah, for me, that's a big, big mistake that a lot of spiritual traditions have made, which is to sort of denigrate what I call these parts and think of them just as the crazy ego or the monkey mind or whatever you want to call it, and encourage you not to pay any attention to them and instead to aspire to these much higher levels of consciousness. There's nothing wrong with that, but you're sort of abandoning all these inner children in doing that. Uh, many people can do that and live a decent life, but they're sort of cut off as a result from a lot of incredibly valuable resources and qualities. And a lot of the parts, if they're ignored long enough, will get revenge somehow in terms of some kind of symptom, either uh, physical or psychological. And so, having met with many spiritual bypassers, it's a challenge to get them to actually take these parts seriously, but it's really important.
Yeah. I'm going to talk a little more about spiritual bypassing in a minute, but let's just get to the idea of the self with a capital S. You make the point that until we uncover that capital S self, which you describe as an essence of calm, clarity, compassion, and connectedness, it's hard to do this work because these parts have been interacting inside us without supervision for all of these years, and that most of them are pretty young. Can you say something more about how this self, capital S, is able to work with these parts that are so young inside us?
Yeah, many of us were not raised to actually know about or lead from that place, even though it is in everybody and can't be damaged and knows how to heal if it's accessed. But instead, many of these young parts, as you mentioned, are forced to become, in a sense, like parentified inner children, so that they're forced to lead our lives, but they're not equipped. But they tend to blend, is my language, with the self, obscuring it, and then and then lead your life. And a lot of that is what is derogatorily called the ego in spirituality, but it's just these little guys trying their best. And so many people live their lives without even any awareness that that's in there. And it isn't until they actually learn how to separate from these parts. And mindfulness has a version of that. And I'm a fan of mindfulness if it didn't just stop at observing them and actually led toward more interaction and loving of them. But just getting them to separate, sort of immediately you access these qualities you just mentioned, and this essence that we're calling the self with a capital S, because it's always in there. It's just covered over or blended with these parts.
Most of mindfulness practice presupposes the mono mind, though, doesn't it? Could you say more about what do you mean by mono mind? What is meant by that?
Yeah, our culture basically thinks of us as having one mind with different thoughts and emotions. And so, and also spirituality, as I keep saying, doesn't see those thoughts and emotions as actually quite very valuable. In fact, they're impediments to your spiritual development a lot of the time. But it's one mind, and if you have these parts, that's because you're pathological. And so, and that model basically comes out of the DID, what used to be called multiple personality disorder world, where these, what they call alters, are the product of trauma. The one mind was split apart by the trauma. And now you've got these shards of the broken vase floating around in there. And the goal is to put Humpty Dumpty back together. It's to round them all up and put them back into one mind so that you don't have what I call parts. And so that's the paradigm I've been up against as I've tried to bring this idea of natural multiplicity, that actually it's the nature of the mind to have these subpersonalities, and that they come into the world with us, and they all have valuable qualities and resources. So it's a mistake to think of them as a sign of pathology.
Walt Whitman understood that. I'm sure you know his great quote, do I contradict myself? Very well, I contradict myself. I'm vast, I contain multitudes.
Exactly. Yeah.
So he knew that before Freud, and before we got this idea of this monolithic thing,
I,
there was that intuition.
yeah.
Yeah. I'm interested in something you say in the book about parenting, the way the self becomes a parent to the inner parts. You say that even if we weren't well parented ourselves, this self knows how to parent our parts. How can that be possible?
I don't really know how. It just is. I mean, I still consider myself to be a scientist. And as I was fooling around, this goes back 40 years, and I was very lucky back in those days to have failed in a trial of family therapy. And at the time, I was working with bulimic kids, and they started talking about their parts and how their parts didn't let them stop. And I didn't know what the hell they were talking about, and then I got scared. I thought maybe they're crazier than I thought, because they were talking about these parts as if they had a lot of autonomy and they had relationships with each other. And then I listened inside myself, and oh my God, I've got them too. Some of mine are pretty extreme about food too. And so then I calmed down and I just started to explore. And as I was doing that, and then as a family therapist, I was hearing about this in her family. I was thinking, who's the leader in there? And is there some kind of good parent available? And as I was having clients explore with that, as I got some parts to open space inside, it was like this other person would pop out suddenly. who had those qualities you mentioned earlier of calm and compassion and confidence and curiosity. And there's four others that characterize what I call self, which include courage and creativity and connectedness and what's the other one?
Clarity.
Clarity, yes. So those make up the essential qualities of self, at least the ones that are most relevant to the healing process. And when that person would come forward, I could step back as a therapist in a sense, because that person would start relating to these parts in a healing way and a nurturing way. And they would respond very differently than they did when they were in their parts to it. And so that self, I came to call that the self with a capital S, because when I would ask clients, what part of you is that? They'd say, that's not a part like these others. That's me. That's my essence. That's myself. So I called that the self with a capital S. And I don't know why, to answer the question. It's an empirical observation that when that is accessed in people, they just know how to be a good inner parent. And they do start to ask the parts the right questions, and then in their mind go to them and hold them and comfort them, and even bring them out of where they're stuck in the past, because most of the parts that we work with got extreme, that they were in their naturally valuable states, and then trauma happened, and then they were forced into these extreme roles, and they're frozen back in the time when the trauma happened, and they carry the extreme beliefs and emotions from that time. The self starts to heal that by going into the past and bringing them into the present and helping them unload these what we call burdens of extreme beliefs and emotions.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't have an answer to the question why.
Or how.
But I've been doing this 40 years, and it's like the same self shows up in everybody. It's got the same qualities and it knows how to heal.
And underlying all of your work is this belief in humanity as being inherently good, which is a Buddhist tenet. It's so different from the notion of total depravity that we're given in certain religions, like with original sin. Can you tell me why a belief in our goodness, how that belief impacts our ability to heal?
Yeah, and again, some of that I didn't start out that way, but just over these 40 years of over and over, when we access that self, good, it's pure goodness, and it is just beneath the surface of these parts, and it can't be damaged. All of that is quite amazing, and so if that's the essence of humanity, then yes, all these other ideas about people are wrong, and that this is who we really are. And again, it's just an empiric observation. And then the other big kind of shocking discovery is that there aren't any bad parts. That's the title of my book you're quoting some from. No bad parts. That as you get to know each of them, they have a self. And when they're released from their extreme roles, they become pure goodness too. So it's a radical position about human nature. And at our annual conference, there are a couple of people that are working in the prisons with murderers and people who restorative justice, things like that. And it makes such a difference when you're working with those people to know that there's goodness in them, and to not just write them off the way psychiatry does as pathological, sociopaths and so on. So yeah, it's something I can actually prove, which it's a nice thing to think about, but if you can't prove it, then it's just a belief system. But I have videos of people who've done heinous things, and as they get these parts of open space, same self pops out in them that pops out in everybody else, and we can go to the part that did the rape or did the murder and get curious about it and learn its secret history of how it got forced and where it's stuck in the past into some trauma scene and so on and so on. So
Mm.
it's a radical position. Yeah.
And it goes beyond the Buddhist idea of ignorance being the thing that prevents us from knowing our goodness.
Yeah.
It says that actually it's unhealed trauma that prevents us from knowing our goodness.
Exactly right. Yeah, that's a big difference.
Yeah. You've said that, and you just mentioned that in moments of trauma, the parts get frozen, and that in order to thaw them, we need to, listen to our troublesome parts rather than fighting them. You also say that it's necessary to get parts out of protective roles for them to be able to speak. Could you just give me an example of a part that might want to protect us from trauma and yet keeps us stuck?
Oh, there's lots and lots of examples. So most people come in with a big critic, for example, and they hate it. And it makes them feel stuck and worthless and young and alone. And uh, it constantly tells them that they're bad, even when they succeed, that it'll find some reason to say you're still bad. And so most spiritualities, as well as most psychotherapies, go to war against that or try to isolate it or not or ignore it or distract from it. And when you do that with that part, it just gets stronger and more determined to make you feel bad. If instead you go with curiosity, either from myself as a therapist or because I can talk to these parts directly, or for you, Mark, I would say, Mark, how do you feel toward this critic? And I would get you to the point where you just felt interested in why it's doing this all the time.
Mm.
And I would say, okay, then ask it. Ask what it's afraid would happen if it didn't yell at you all day,
Mm.
or if it didn't make you feel like shit. And it might give some extreme answer at first, but if you keep asking that question, what's it afraid would happen if it didn't do this job? At some point, it'll acknowledge that it's trying to protect you,
Mm.
that it's afraid if it didn't make you feel bad, you might start feeling good about yourself. And
Mm.
then you'd start taking risks in the world.
Mm.
Then you'd be smashed by the world. And often it's stuck back in a time when that actually happened to you, or it's carrying the beliefs from your family that has some kind of legacy burden about staying small all the time. And as you learn that about it, that it's really just, even though it's got you really stuck, it's really just trying to keep you safe.
Mm.
And I would say, okay, Mark, how do you feel toward it now? And you could say, well, I feel sad for it. I feel compassion for it. I actually feel like it's desperately been trying to help me. And
Mm.
I've been so hard on it. And can you extend that compassion to it and see how it reacts to your compassion? And these parts will start to melt because no one's ever listened to them and realized they're just trying to help.
Mm.
And so on and so on. So then there's a whole set of practices to actually help relieve that critic of its role and help it transform into its naturally valuable state.
Mm. You talk about a kind of homeostasis that happens psychologically, psychospiritually, that when we start to get too big, or we start to move toward what you call the self-led life, capital S, that our protectors come in to hold us back. Who do you think you are? Don't get too big for your bridges. Um, how can we befriend the that process when it happens, when we want so much to grow and we feel like we're just at odds with ourselves? Do we start to dialogue with that homeostatic response?
Yeah, and it's very similar to what I was just describing. So if I was working with you and you came in with that problem, I would say, Mark, okay, focus on that voice that says, "Don't get too big for your britches," and find it in your body, and you could find it. It's got a location.
Hmm.
And I would say, how do you feel toward it? And you would say, well, it's holding me back. It's so frustrating. I can't stand it. I want to get rid of it. And I would say, okay, that makes sense, but we're going to ask all these parts that are polarized with it to just give us a chance to get to know it.
Mhm.
Maybe even help it not have to do this job anymore.
Mm.
And as we did that, and if I could get you into that state, then I could have you begin a dialogue with it.
Mhm.
And and it would go sort of the way I was talking about with that critic. And a lot of times, just in asking what it's afraid would happen, you learn that it's protecting some other very vulnerable parts that did get hurt and when you stepped out into the world, and they're still living back in those scenes.
Mhm.
And this critic isn't going to really change
Mhm.
until you heal those parts. So it doesn't have to constantly worry about them being triggered again.
Mhm. Mhm. I get it. Let's talk about the ego a little bit because the ego is so often vilified in spiritual life, particularly, but you don't see it that way. You write, quote, "The ego is a cluster of managers who are trying to run your life and keep you safe." So the idea is to befriend and listen to what we call ego instead of trying to just constantly override it or diminish it.
Yeah, very similar to what we. I mean, the this critic is often one of those managers. There are a lot of other common manager roles that comprise the ego. Some of these include a part that strives to achieve things and to be responsible and take care of people, and sometimes takes care of everybody but doesn't let you take care of yourself, for example. Uh, there are parts uh, that are just keep you in your head. They don't let you feel much of your body, and they keep you thinking in an intellectual way all the time. And those parts are particularly annoying to spiritual types. And so, yeah, and it's all true. The ego is getting in the way of your accessing these higher levels. It's true. And so it makes sense that a lot of spiritualities are trying to fight that or trying to ignore it. But what we find is that if you go with love to these parts and learn about how they're trying to operate and work, and ask them to give you space to go to these higher places, so you go with permission, then you don't have to meditate nearly as much because you don't have to fight them off all the time.
Mhm.
And they just kind of allow it. They bask in it. They can join you in that sort of bath of spiritual energy that we call self energy. So so it's a very different approach to meditation and to lots of other things.
Mhm. Let's talk about spiritual bypassing. You talk about confusing self avoidance with enlightenment. And you also mentioned that many people come to spiritual traditions with lots of exiles, which are those parts of ourselves that we exile, because of the intense trauma in their backgrounds, hoping for relief. How can we recognize when we're avoiding our exiles and engaged in spiritual bypassing?
Yeah, I'll tell you my own personal story. So I came out of my family with a lot of worthlessness and sort of assumption that I didn't have much to contribute to the world, and a lot of anxiety because of that about my future. And went through college and got out of college and had no clue about what I wanted to do, and was pretty anxious, and then ran into TM and uh, became very ardent meditator and found that it really helped with that anxiety. I mean, I really, the mantra would just take me away and I could feel some of the bliss and, it just, I thought I'd found the answer. And it actually did help. I mean, I actually could function better and could concentrate better. I didn't have so much ADD as I had before. And I felt better in general. but I was also abandoning all these parts of me that carried the anxiety that way, and they weren't being touched by it,
mm,
the anxiety and the worthlessness. And I became kind of addicted to the meditation,
mm,
and because it could keep me above all that, keep me away from all that.
mm,
And because I didn't know this model at that point, I just thought, I'm just feeling better. What's wrong with that?
mm,
And so now, having worked with many people that come to me with similar kind of spiritual attachment to some spiritual practice, and will say what's wrong with doing it. And I'll say nothing's wrong with it, but you do have these symptoms. And if we could not do that and get that spiritual part to step out a little bit, we can go to the parts that aren't being served by it and actually get them out of where they're stuck in the past and heal them. And then the spiritual practice is good for everybody in there. It isn't just getting you away from these other parts. So
mm,
does
mm.
that make sense?
That makes total sense. Yeah, that makes total sense. So many of us come to spiritual life just wanting the pain to go away.
Exactly.
We think that it's very simple why we're doing it. We're doing it because we're hurting so badly. And the mind sort of seeks, the shortest distance between 2 points. How do I get out of pain? And so we try to leapfrog it. And so it sounds to me like an integration of those two practices, being aware of the self, and allowing ourselves to meditate and have those kinds of experiences, without ignoring the population inside of us that is.
Yeah. And that's where I landed, that it's not one or the other. So what I'm calling the self, for me, it took a while, but it became a very spiritual idea that uh, what I'm calling the self and describe with those 8C qualities is a drop of a much bigger ocean that people have a lot of different words for. The source, or I call the big self, or God, or whatever you want to call it, the non-dual, that there's a drop of that in each of us, or I love the metaphor from quantum physics of particle and a wave. We particleize when we're in our bodies, but through meditation or through psychedelics, we can actually enter that big wave where we don't feel separate from anything. And and then when you come back from the psychedelic trip, you feel, oh God, now that I'm back, I've got boundaries and I am separate from everybody and all that. So, but that idea that the self isn't just individualized but is connected at that level to everybody else's self,
Mm,
and that through these practices you can actually access that. And a lot of spiritual practices are very good at, like TM was good at helping me access that.
mm,
But don't access it to always stay up there. Access it so that you can bring more of it back into here that can actually help your parts too,
mm,
and do both.
mm. That
So it's more like that.
makes total sense. I love what a theology professor said to you. He said, "You're asking us to do inside ourselves what Jesus did in the outside world."
Yeah.
What do you think he meant by that?
Well, Jesus went to the poor people, or he went to the exiles in his culture, the lepers, all the downtrodden people with love, um, and so we're just asking people to do the same thing with their exiled parts inside, to not shun them, or keep them out of your inner society or your inner family, but to actually do what Jesus did in the outside world.
Mm, mm, mm. To go to the least among us.
Yeah,
And
perfect. Yeah.
right, right. It's such a beautiful thing for someone to say about your work.
Yeah. No, I couldn't believe it because I this was this was at a seminary in Mississippi that was very fundamentalist Christian. I went down with a lot of trepidation, but when the professor got up and said that, I just felt, oh, okay, they're getting it.
They're
Yeah,
getting it. Yeah, yeah.
I'm getting it. I'm getting whatever. We're able to talk about this in a similar way.
I'd like to just ask you about these eight qualities of self energy and self leadership that you mentioned earlier in passing. And can you give me a brief sense? I'll give you the quality and give us a brief sense of why it matters to a self led life. So let's start with curiosity.
Yeah, and when I talk about curiosity, the curiosity of self is a bit different from some parts of us that are curious but have an agenda and are trying to learn about something so that we can use it or even manipulate it. But self is just purely interested in what you're like, Mark. Just I
Hmm.
just want to get to know you without a lot of my ego or agenda at all. Just that kind of um, Buddha nature, uh, or what's the word in Buddhism for that kind of curiosity?
I don't actually know.
I'm not sure. So, um, yeah, and that's a real foundational quality. So, if I get triggered and there goes compassion and there goes confidence and there goes connectedness. And if I can just stay curious
Hmm.
with whoever is triggering me and lead from that place, then I can round up all these parts will start, these qualities of self will come back.
Hmm.
Uh,
So curiosity is the open door. Curiosity is what makes the whole investigation possible.
exactly, yeah. And
Right.
and it's unfortunately quite rare to be with somebody when they're in that kind of open-minded, open open-minded and then leads to open-hearted play.
And yet, it's the quality most people will tell you about that's different about being with a master, a true spiritual master, is you feel like you're the most important person in the world. Nobody else exists, and they're paying full attention. And that's what people take away from those encounters a lot of the time.
I think that's right. And part of why they're a master is because they embody so much of this self energy, because they've done their work on the parts of them that need to. I'll be curious about you, but then I want you to hear about me. And
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
I
yeah.
want you to really like me or be impressed by me. So
Right, right.
when
Enough,
you're really
enough about you. What about me?
about me, yeah. When you're really in self, you don't have that. You're just kind of curious about whoever's in front of you, or you're curious about. I was watching a spider make a web the other day, and it's amazing. And
Mhm.
so you're just curious about the world, which I'm not trying to pretend like I'm one of those masters, but there are times when I can be in that much self.
Hmm. Let's go to the second quality, calm. Why is calm so important to this self-led life?
Yeah, I mean it's if I can be calm, it becomes contagious. So uh, and self in general is contagious. So
Mm.
as a therapist, for example, if I'm working with a couple and they're in huge conflict, if I can stay in that calm place and not get caught up in it at all, that will help them access their own calm. And um, and a lot of the parts that take us away from calm, that like I had that big anxious part and parts that make us very agitated and impatient and so on, also block access to this higher self energy. So if I can, if I go to do a thing like we're doing, and before I do it, I'll stop and I'll say, okay, how am I feeling? I've got markers to know how much I'm in self and not. So is my heart open, or how open is it? Or do I have a big agenda with this podcast? Or so I'm just checking these markers. And one of them is, how calm am I? Am I feeling agitated at all?
Mm.
And if I detect any departures from those C word qualities, then I know that's a part of me that's that's involved. And so I'll focus on it and I'll just ask it to relax back for the duration of our hour and let me be calm and let me just have an open heart and let me be curious. And now I've been practicing that for a long time, so I can very quickly access those qualities because my parts trust that it's safe. They know, and my line to them often is, it always goes better if you let me handle things. If you let me lead, it'll always go better, and they know that now. So so calm is one of the qualities of a good therapist or just a good listener. Just this sense that, and it's also when you're really in self, it's really hard to shift you away from that calm place, even in the middle of a crisis. So, yeah.
What about confidence? Confidence, by confidence, you don't mean bravado, you don't mean denying insecurity. What do you mean by confidence?
Yeah. So, what I've found in trying to work with people is that they'll have parts that don't want us to go to these raw places in what we call exiles that are really, really afraid of opening that door and feeling some of what happened and where these parts are stuck in the past. This is just one example where confidence is so important. And, until I had a lot of confidence that we could actually heal those parts, it would take long, long time for these protective parts to trust that there was any value in opening that door. But now I'll do a demo, and in a matter of 15 minutes, people are there, and that's because I come with such confidence now. That's palpable. It's a kind of palpable energy, and also, and this relates to calm too. There's this calm, confident tone of voice that people remark about when I'm doing a demo. And that's very soothing to these protective parts, just that calm, confident energy. And then I'll make statements like, I promise we can do this. I know it's going to be hard and it'll be scary. But I guarantee if you open the door, if you let us do it, we can heal this and this and this. And that'll make your job as a protector that much easier because you won't have to worry about all the time being so protective and you can do something entirely different. So, and if you can come to people with that same level of confidence, uh, it's remarkable how much they are willing to collaborate.
Mm. And compassion, that feels kind of obvious, but is there anything new in terms of insight you've had around compassion and working with parts?
Um, yeah, and what's most striking, like I think I mentioned that I've worked with sex offenders and I've worked with people that have parts that have done horrible things in their lives, and I want them to get to know these parts and be at least curious. And as I get other parts that hate them to step back and relax, it blows my mind every time when I say, now, how do you feel toward this one who did this horrible thing? And they'll say, I kind of feel sorry for it. I feel sad that it had to do that, and I want to help it. Out of the blue. I didn't lead the person to think that or feel that. We didn't have to build up the muscle of compassion. It's just there when you get enough access, even with parts that have done heinous things. And once that's there, then I know it's all going to go well because I'll say, now extend that compassion to that part and see how it reacts. And a lot of these parts, they've never had anybody be compassionate to it. But gradually, if you can just hold them in that compassionate place, part will start to drop its guard and share its secret history of how it got forced into this role that has caused such damage. And so this, I can do the same thing. Like we have an exercise where I would have you, Mark, think of a person in your life that triggers the hell out of you and that you generally don't like. and put that person in a room by themselves with a window, and you're separate from the person, but you're looking at them, and have them do the thing that triggers you. And then I would have you find the part that gets so triggered and get it to give you some space, and then take another look at the person. And whereas your first image was them being ugly and menacing, in that second state, if you looked again, you could see past their protectors to their exiles.
Mm-hmm.
Like you could see what drives them to be so extreme, and you would have compassion. And it's just there. It's just there. It's magic.
That we need that so badly today in this polarized moment. Let's move on. I want to get to questions soon, but creativity. What do you mean by creativity? How does that align with a self-led life?
Yeah. Again, I started the inner world. So if you're blended with certain parts and you're trying to relate to other parts, you're not going to be creative. You're going to be kind of authoritarian, or you're going to be rigid in how you relate. But once those parts open space and you get into self, people naturally do very creative things in terms of how they relate and how they help these parts. And again, it's just kind of natural. And the same is true. There are people bringing this to artists, for example, and helping them access that creativity that's just there, rather than learning all the skills to be a good artist. Um, you do have to learn some skills,
Mm-hmm.
but for so many, I was just talking to a woman at Harvard who is helping teachers try to do better teaching, and uh, and she's trying to help them help their students with their anxious parts, because Harvard is just pure anxiety. Students and teachers are constantly worried about surviving. And that contradicts creativity. You can't be real creative when you're that scared.
Mm-hmm.
And so rather than trying to teach creativity, they're starting to help them uh, calm those scared parts.
Mm-hmm.
And and then they're finding the creativity is right there.
Mm-hmm. Wow. What about clarity? What do you mean by clarity in this context? And is that connected to mindfulness, for example?
Is it connected to mindfulness? I don't know. But again, it's very similar to what I was saying earlier about compassion, that when you're blended with some of these protectors, they're the lens through which you see the world. And with some of them, you just see negative things everywhere, and your partner looks ugly,
Mm-hmm.
and because you're mad at her, uh, and and then again, if you get that part to step back, you see clearly, and your partner is beautiful, and the world is beautiful also. And so it's that kind of clarity we're talking about.
Mm-hmm. And courage, I think courage, that's kind of it's I think I can sort of guess why courage matters. Could how does courage relate to the large self?
Yeah, so when you get more access to self, uh, people come to me with, they want to change their jobs, or they want to get out of a bad relationship and they're stuck. And as we work with the parts that are holding them back and they access more self, they just naturally do it. And they're not afraid in the way they were, because they now have access to that courage. Yeah.
Hmm. And finally, connectedness. Connectedness underlies this whole teaching. So how does a sense of an awareness of connectedness open our mind and enable our parts to operate with less burden and less legacy, less negative legacy?
Yeah. Well, as you access more self, you naturally feel more connected to
Hmm.
people around you. You have more of an intuition about that big self, and how at that level we're all connected. And so all of it ties together. The more connected you feel to people, and the more compassion you have for them, and the more clearly you see them, and the more courage you have to act to help them, you stop living in this, sort of egocentric world, and you start to do things in the world of service a lot of the time.
Mhm.
And that's I've been amazed at how much clients start to do that and at least think about it as they access more self.
Mhm.
And you find that just that becomes very rewarding. And it's nice to leave all that egotism in the past.
Mhm. Yeah. I could talk to you for for 3 hours. We're not going to be able to talk about psychedelics, but maybe next time. And now we're just going to open up the line. Jay is actually going to read some questions from chat. I'm assuming we have questions, Jay.
Yes, and please do continue to post them. We'll get to as many as we can. Susan asks, how does one do IFS work while also dealing in the present with family members that are all entangled in a legacy of trauma?
It's challenging, more challenging if you're dependent on those family members. And so as we try to work with kids and families, we'll also try to work with their family members. Because if you're living in a dangerous or if you're constantly triggered in your external environment, then your protectors are going to have a lot more trouble relaxing and allowing you to do this kind of healing work. And we can do it, it just takes a lot more time and a lot more appreciation of how scary it is, to open space in there. And I mentioned working with bulimia in the early days, but I was at this Institute for Juvenile Research in Chicago in the West Side, and I was working with kids from the streets, and they would say, if I'm ever vulnerable on the street, I'll be killed. And it was true. And so we had to do lots of negotiating with their protectors about, is it safe to be vulnerable in my office? And is it safe to be vulnerable with a white man? And so we'd have to go over all of that. And I'd have to earn their trust in a lot of ways before they'd be willing to go to these vulnerable places so they could heal. And so basically all I'm saying is it just makes it harder. It's not impossible, but it's a lot harder.
Thank you. And Emma asks, uh, I've heard this process related to physical disease, and I'm personally investigating this in relation to having had breast cancer. This is a complex question, but do you think there are parts which, when they don't get heard, eventually use physical manifestations to get attention? Or
Very
do you
much.
explain this in another way?
No, that's very, very accurate. Our big outcome study was done at Harvard's Brigham and Women's Hospital with rheumatoid arthritis. And we had 30 Irish Catholic mothers, basically, severe rheumatoid arthritis, and control group of 30, and did about 16 sessions with the treatment group and had them focus on the pain and get curious about the pain. And in doing that, they would hear from the parts of them that were trying to use the pain to get their attention because they were so dominated by these caretaking parts, being Irish Catholic mothers, that wouldn't let them take care of themselves ever. And these parts were furious with that caretaking part and were using the pain either to get their attention or to try and sabotage the caretaking, or the variety of reasons they would use it. And as we worked that out and got more of a time sharing thing going with these parts, the arthritis got much better, very significant findings. And so we do use it a lot with various kinds of medical conditions. And it's pretty simple. You just focus on the symptom itself, get curious about it, and then ask if there's something I want you to know, I want to also be clear that there are a lot of symptoms that don't seem to be related to parts, or the parts are only once in a while using. I have predispositions for asthma and for migraine headaches. And if a part wants to take me out, it'll push the migraine button. And I know I only learned that by asking. And now I don't get migraines. But if I'm in a dusty room, I'll get an asthma attack, and it's got nothing to do with my parts. So, it's not all one or the other, but it never hurts to ask, in other words.
Thank you. Nikki has two questions. Do the parts dissolve over time, or does the increase in self-energy simply quiet them? And are trauma responses parts?
So the first question, no, they don't dissolve, and it's good they don't, because they should be there. And again, too many spiritualities, that's the goal, is to have them dissolve. So they transform out of their extreme roles into their naturally valuable states. And as they do that, you don't notice them a lot of the time, because they're just behind the scenes helping you. And there's a lot more harmony in your inner world, so they don't stand out at all. But they don't disappear. And what was the second question?
Are trauma responses parts?
Yes, in the sense that if somebody's having a panic attack, or if I just have them focus on the panic and use that as what we call a trailhead, it'll take us to the part that's stuck in the trauma and is still living back as if that's still happening. And so, yes, the answer is yes.
Thank you. Dana asks, how do you measure and quantify your markers?
My marker is about if I'm in self or not. Is that what he's asking? Or she?
Yeah. Dana, if you want to share a little, there she goes. Yes.
I don't have a measure for it, but as you do this more and more, and you get a sense for when you're in self and when you're not, then you just have an intuition about it. You can just sense it. And again, I can sense how open my heart is, or I can sense how much calm is in my gut. And so it isn't anything measurable or quantifiable, but through practice, you can really feel the difference. You really get good at noticing when you're blended with these parts and when you're not.
Alma shares, I have the challenge of being First Nations, as if hundreds of years of beauty of love for nature and family ancestors are present. At times I cannot physically move, the trauma of my indigenous tribes being upfront in my chest, heart area, and mind. I go to my compassion part, yet I can get triggered by acquaintances who seemingly try to teach me to be more like them, and I retreat to self. What can I do to create more peace in my present life, which I honor?
Mm-hmm. So what you bring up is what we call legacy burdens, which I didn't touch on today, I don't think. But yeah, for people whose ancestors suffered horrible traumas, a lot of that gets passed down through the generations, uh, and so it can totally affect your life now. And it's possible to find those legacy burdens and the parts that carry them, and help them unload those, help them send them out of your system, and get a lot of relief from that. And so that's become a big topic of interest in the IFS community the last 20 years or so, is how to work with these legacy burdens, which I think are really driving a lot of the conflicts in the world.
No question.
Nikki says, as a therapist myself in the psychodynamic tradition, I'm very curious about IFS. I've been unable to get into a training, but do workshops whenever I can. I'm convinced too that if IFS can help me access freedom in a way that my current therapy cannot, is it advisable to try to do this on my own?
A lot of people can do a lot on their own. And then some people, like myself, can do a certain amount, and then I'll get to a place that I really need somebody to be there. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a therapist, but it would be helpful if they knew the model a bit so they can get you unblended from where you're stuck. But yeah, it's certainly worth a try. And we have a lot of meditations out there that are useful for that. And we're actually coming out with a kind of workbook shortly about how the public can actually do some of this on their own.
Well, that's great. We'll stop it there. I want to be respectful of your time, Dick. It's been such a great conversation. I'm so grateful to you for visiting us at the Seekers Forum. And folks, I just cannot say enough about Dick's work. I'm a huge fan. Go out and get yourself a copy of No Bad Parts. It's a sensational, very clear book. And just good luck with everything, Dick. And I hope we see each other again soon.
I do too, Mark. And, I really appreciate the research you did, and the questions were great. So I do a lot of interviews, and this was one of the better ones. So I appreciate it.
Thank you. Good to see you. Take good care. Bye, everybody. Thanks for joining us.